Amid a funeral, something draws everyone's attention. The loyal dog of the deceased begins to bark non-stop. The animal's restlessness reveals dark secrets. A stranger starts questioning what is really hidden in that coffin. The grey sky hung over the cemetery like a heavy shroud of sorrow. The cold autumn breeze whispered among the gravestones, carrying with it the damp scent of freshly dug earth. A silent crowd gathered around a polished mahogany casket, their faces marked by grief and confusion. At the center of it all lay the body of Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, a beloved figure in the community, whose sudden departure had left an inexplicable void in all hearts. Father Michael, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and an austere countenance, began the ceremony with a grave voice. "We are gathered here to bid farewell to our dear Eleanor, a woman whose kindness—" His words were abruptly interrupted by a sharp, desperate bark. All eyes turned to the source of the sound, Buddy, Mrs. Thompson's faithful canine companion. The dog, a golden-haired mutt with expressive eyes, stood beside the casket, barking incessantly as if his life depended on it. "Can someone control that animal?" an irritated voice whispered in the crowd. But Buddy wouldn't quiet down. His eyes were fixed on the casket, and his body trembled with anxiety. People began to murmur, casting worried glances at one another. The dog's behavior was more than simple grief. There was something urgent, almost frantic about his barks. Among those present, one man stood out. Recently arrived in town, Jack observed the scene with an interest that went beyond mere curiosity. His perceptive eyes scanned the location, analyzing every detail, every reaction. There was something in the atmosphere, a palpable tension that went beyond the normal grief of a funeral. Father Michael, visibly disturbed, tried to regain control of the situation. "Please, could someone take the dog away? Someone take the—" "We're trying to conduct a respectful ceremony." But the more people tried to move Buddy away, the more frantic his barks became. The dog seemed determined to communicate something that only he could see or feel. Jack stepped forward, his calm voice cutting through the tense air. "Excuse me, Father. Perhaps we should pay attention to what the dog is trying to tell us." The priest shot Jack an irritated look. "And who are you to interrupt this ceremony?" "Just someone who believes that sometimes animals can sense things that we humans cannot," Jack replied, maintaining a respectful but firm tone. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some agreed with Jack, others seemed annoyed by the interruption. Father Michael, however, seemed more than irritated. There was a flash of fear in his eyes. "This is ridiculous," the priest said, his voice trembling slightly. "Let's continue with the ceremony. The dog is probably just disturbed by the loss of his owner." But the priest's words sounded hollow, and Jack noticed the sweat that was beginning to form on his forehead, despite the cold. There was something else going on here, something the priest seemed desperate to hide. Buddy, as if understanding the gravity of the moment, intensified his barking. His eyes alternated between the casket and Father Michael's face, as if accusing the man of something terrible. The tension in the air was palpable. What should have been a peaceful farewell had turned into a scene of mystery and suspicion. People began to look at each other, uncertain about how to proceed. It was then that Jack made a decision. He approached the casket, ignoring the priest's protests. Carefully, he knelt beside Buddy, gently stroking the dog's head. "What are you seeing, Buddy?" he murmured, more to himself than to the animal. "What are you trying to tell us?" At that moment, as if answering Jack's question, Buddy stopped barking. A heavy silence fell over the cemetery. The dog looked directly into Jack's eyes, and in that gaze the man saw an intelligence and determination that surprised him. Jack slowly stood up, his gaze now fixed on Father Michael. "Father," he said, his voice calm but laden with intention, "I think we need to talk about Mrs. Thompson. Is there something you'd like to tell us?" The priest's face visibly paled. He opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. The silence that followed was deafening, heavy with unasked questions and unrevealed secrets. And so in that cloudy cemetery, what should have been a simple goodbye transformed into the beginning of a mystery that promised to shake the foundations of the small town. Buddy's bark had echoed in the silence, and now the waves of that sound were about to reveal long-buried truths. The sun was already setting when Jack left the cemetery, his mind full of unanswered questions. Buddy's strange behavior and Father Michael's nervous reaction had planted a seed of doubt that was now growing rapidly. Determined to unravel the mystery, he headed to the local church, hoping to find some clue about what had really happened to Mrs. Thompson. The church, an old stone building, cast long shadows in the twilight. Jack hesitated for a moment before pushing open the heavy wooden door. The interior was silent, only the echo of his footsteps breaking the sacred quietude. "Hello?" he called, his voice reverberating off the walls. There was no response. Cautiously, Jack advanced down the central aisle, his eyes alert to any unusual detail. That's when he heard it. A whisper almost inaudible coming from the sacristy. He approached silently, heart racing. "We can't let them find out," said a voice that Jack recognized as Father Michael's. "If anyone knows the truth about Eleanor, all will be lost." "But what if that man keeps asking questions?" replied a second voice, trembling and anxious. He seemed very interested in the dog's behavior. Jack froze, barely daring to breathe. Who was this second person? And what exactly were they trying to hide? "Calm down, Sister Sarah," said the priest, his voice taking on a firmer tone. "Nobody is going to discover anything. We have to maintain our composure and stick to the plan." Jack retreated silently, his mind working furiously to process what he had just heard. Clearly there was more to Mrs. Thompson's story than a simple, natural departure. But what? Deciding he needed more information, Jack left the church as quietly as he had entered. The sky was now completely dark, the stars shining coldly above. He began to walk towards the town center, determined to find out more about Mrs. Thompson and her connection to the church. On the way, he passed through the central square, where a group of elderly people were playing checkers under the light of a lamppost. Jack approached, hoping someone could provide more information about the deceased. "Excuse me," he said, addressing a gray-haired lady. "Did you know Mrs. Thompson?" The woman looked at him with narrowed eyes, suspicious. "And who wants to know?" "My name is Jack. I'm new in town and, well, I was intrigued by what happened at the funeral today." The mention of the funeral seemed to break the ice. The lady, who introduced herself as Mrs. Davis, indicated the bench beside her. "Sit down, young man. Eleanor was my friend for over 40 years. What happened today was strange, to say the least." Jack sat down, eager to hear more. "Her dog, Buddy. He seemed to be trying to tell us something." Mrs. Davis nodded gravely. "Buddy was always a smart dog, but today he seemed possessed. You know, Eleanor had been acting strange in the last few weeks, worried about something, always looking over her shoulder. Do you have any idea what might have been bothering her?" The elderly woman hesitated, casting a nervous glance around before leaning closer to Jack. "Well, she mentioned something about the church, said she had discovered something she shouldn't have, but before she could tell me more, well, you know." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. "And Father Michael? How was his relationship with Mrs. Thompson?" "Oh, they were always close," Mrs. Davis replied. "Eleanor was one of the church's biggest donors, but in the last few weeks she seemed to be avoiding him. And the priest. Well, he seemed nervous whenever her name was mentioned." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Jack turned to see Sister Sarah walking hurriedly across the square, her face pale in the lamplight. Her eyes met Jack's for a brief moment, and he could see the fear in them before she looked away and quickened her pace. "That's Sister Sarah," Mrs. Davis murmured. "She works at the church with Father Michael. Lately she's been acting as nervous as he has." Jack thanked Mrs. Davis for the information and said goodbye, his mind spinning with the new revelations. As he walked back to the inn where he was staying, he couldn't help but feel that he was getting close to something big, something that could shake the foundations of this small town. Suddenly, a familiar bark cut through the night air. Jack turned to see Buddy standing a few yards away, his eyes gleaming in the darkness. The dog seemed to be waiting for him. "Hey, Buddy," Jack said softly, approaching. "You're trying to solve this mystery too, aren't you?" Buddy barked once as if in confirmation, and then turned, starting to walk. He stopped after a few steps, looking back as if inviting Jack to follow him. Without hesitation, Jack began to follow the dog. As they walked through the dark streets of the town, he couldn't help but wonder where Buddy was leading him and what secrets they would discover together. The night was just beginning, and Jack had the feeling that before dawn, many truths would come to light. The mystery of Mrs. Thompson was far from solved, but each step he took brought him closer to the truth, a truth that, he suspected, would forever change the course of this small town and all its inhabitants. Jack followed Buddy through the dark and winding streets of the town, his heart racing with anticipation of the unknown. The dog seemed to have a clear destination in mind, moving with purpose and determination. After a few minutes of walking, Jack realized they were approaching an older residential area, where well-preserved Victorian houses lined tree-lined streets. Buddy stopped abruptly in front of one of these houses, an imposing two-story building with a wraparound porch and tall windows. The house was dark and silent, emanating an aura of abandonment. Jack recognized the place immediately. It was Mrs. Thompson's residence. "Is this where you wanted to bring me, boy?" Jack murmured, patting Buddy's head. The dog barked softly in response and climbed the porch steps, scratching at the front door. Jack hesitated for a moment, aware that he was about to trespass on private property. But the urgency in Buddy's eyes and the mystery surrounding it all propelled him forward. Carefully, Jack tested the doorknob, and to his surprise, it turned without resistance. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing a dark and dusty interior. The smell of mold and abandonment filled the air. "Hello?" Jack called, more out of habit than expectation of a response. The silence was absolute. Buddy entered without hesitation, his tail wagging slightly as he moved with familiarity through the space. Jack followed him, using his cell phone flashlight to illuminate the way. The living room was untouched, with furniture covered by white sheets, looking like ghosts in the gloom. The dog led them to a study at the back of the house. Here, unlike the rest of the residence, there were signs of recent use. Papers were scattered across a massive oak desk, and a half-empty cup of tea still sat on a coaster. "Looks like Mrs. Thompson was here not too long ago," Jack murmured to himself, examining the documents. Most of the papers seemed to be mundane correspondence and bills, but one envelope in particular caught his attention. It was addressed to the bishop of the diocese, but had never been sent. Carefully, Jack opened the envelope and began to read the letter inside. "Your Excellency, it is with great sorrow and concern that I address Your Excellency. I have discovered serious irregularities in the accounts of the parish of Our Lady of Peace. Substantial funds have been diverted over the past few years, and I fear that Father Michael is at the center of this scandal. Initially, I hesitated to believe it, but the evidence is irrefutable. Documents I found by chance show suspicious transfers and unjustified expenses. Most alarming is that part of this money seems to be being used for—" The letter ended abruptly there, as if Mrs. Thompson had been interrupted in the middle of her writing. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. This explained Father Michael's strange behavior and Sister Sarah's nervousness. But what had happened to Mrs. Thompson? Had she confronted the priest with her discoveries? As Jack pondered these questions, Buddy barked again, this time more insistently. The dog was scratching at a section of the baseboard near the fireplace. Intrigued, Jack approached and examined the area more closely. To his surprise, he noticed that a small section of the baseboard seemed loose. Carefully, he removed the piece of wood, revealing a small hidden compartment. Inside, he found a hardcover notebook and a USB drive. The notebook was a diary, and the most recent entries detailed Mrs. Thompson's discoveries about the church's fund diversion scheme. The last entry, dated just 3 days before her supposed death, was particularly disturbing. "I confronted Father Michael today. He denied everything, of course, but I could see the panic in his eyes. He told me to forget what I saw, that it was better for everyone. When I refused, he threatened me, said I didn't know who I was dealing with, that there were powerful people involved. I'm afraid of what might happen, but I can't stay quiet in the face of such corruption. Tomorrow, I'm going to the police with all the evidence. May God protect me." Jack felt his heart race. It was clear now that Mrs. Thompson's death had not been natural. But if she wasn't dead, where could she be? Suddenly, a noise coming from upstairs made Jack and Buddy freeze. Slow, heavy footsteps echoed above them, moving towards the stairs. Jack quickly put the diary and the USB drive in his pockets, replaced the baseboard, and signaled for Buddy to be quiet. With his heart in his throat, he moved silently towards the study window, carefully opening it. As he helped Buddy out the window and prepared to follow him, Jack heard the footsteps reach the bottom of the stairs. Whoever it was, they were about to enter the study. With one last look back, Jack exited through the window, closing it silently behind him. He and Buddy hid in the garden bushes, watching as a hooded figure entered the study, a flashlight sweeping the environment. Jack knew he had to get out of there as fast as possible. The information he had just discovered was explosive and potentially dangerous. But one thing was certain: Mrs. Thompson was alive somewhere, and he needed to find her before it was too late. With Buddy by his side, Jack snuck through the garden and back to the street, his mind spinning with the night's revelations. The mystery was far from solved, but now he had concrete clues to follow. The truth was within his reach, and Jack was determined to expose it, no matter the cost. As they walked quickly down the dark street, Jack couldn't help but wonder exactly what he had gotten himself into. One thing was certain: the peaceful small town he had known a few days ago hid much darker secrets than he could have imagined. And now, whether he wanted to or not, he was at the center of it all. Dawn found Jack sitting in his room at the inn, his eyes red with fatigue, but his mind in frantic activity. Buddy slept at his feet, occasionally stirring in his canine dreams. The table in front of Jack was covered with papers, the notes he had made during the night, based on Mrs. Thompson's diary and the files from the USB drive. The picture that was forming was disturbing. The church's fund diversion scheme was just the tip of the iceberg. There were indications of a corruption network that extended far beyond the limits of the small town, involving powerful figures in regional politics and even the judiciary. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Cautious, Jack stood up, signaling for Buddy to be quiet. "Who is it?" he asked, approaching the door. "It's me, Lisa," came the whispered response. "Mrs. Davis's granddaughter. Please, I need to talk to you." Jack hesitated for a moment before opening the door. On the other side, he found a young woman of about 25, dark hair tied back in a ponytail, restless eyes scanning the corridor. "Can I come in?" she asked, urgency in her voice. "It's not safe to talk out here." Jack nodded, giving way. Lisa entered quickly, closing the door behind her. Her eyes widened when she saw Buddy. "Mrs. Thompson's dog. So it's true, you're investigating what happened to her." "How do you know about this?" Jack asked, suspicious. Lisa took a deep breath. "My grandmother told me about your conversation last night. Listen, I know it might seem strange, but I want to help. Mrs. Thompson was like a second grandmother to me, and I know something is very wrong with this whole story." Jack studied the young woman's face, looking for signs of deception, but saw only sincerity and concern. "All right," he said finally. "What do you know?" In the minutes that followed, Lisa shared precious information. As a local journalist, she had access to sources and rumors circulating around town. She confirmed Jack's suspicions about the corruption network and added new details. "There are rumors about a big real estate development that's about to be approved," Lisa explained. "A luxury resort that will revitalize the local economy. But for that, they need to expropriate several properties, including church lands." "And let me guess," Jack interrupted, "those lands are worth much more than what's being officially offered." Lisa nodded. "Exactly. And here's the part that links all this to Mrs. Thompson. She was the only property owner who refused to sell. Her house is right in the center of the area planned for the resort." The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together in Jack's mind. So, when she discovered the church's fund diversion scheme, she inadvertently stumbled upon something much bigger, Lisa concluded. Something certain people would be willing to do anything to keep secret. The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with implications. It was Buddy who broke it, suddenly getting up and going to the window, barking softly. Jack joined the dog, cautiously peering outside. On the street, a black car was parked, two men in suits watching the inn's entrance. "I think we have company," Jack muttered, turning to Lisa. "Do you know any safe place where we can continue this conversation?" Lisa thought for a moment. "Yes, the old library. The basement has an archive room that almost no one uses. We can meet there in an hour." Jack nodded. "Great. I'll go out the back with Buddy. You go out the front normally. If they ask you, say you came to interview a tourist for the local newspaper." When Lisa left, Jack quickly gathered his belongings, including the evidence he had collected. With Buddy by his side, he descended the fire escape at the back of the inn. The town streets were beginning to come to life with the morning movement. Jack kept his head down, blending into the crowd, always alert for any sign that he was being followed. Arriving at the library, an imposing Victorian building in the center of town, Jack waited a few minutes before entering, making sure no one was watching him. In the cool and silent interior, He found his way to the basement, Buddy always alert at his side. The archive room was a maze of tall shelves filled with dusty boxes and old documents. Jack found a hidden corner and sat down to wait, absent-mindedly petting Buddy's head. His mind was buzzing with the new information. The mystery surrounding Mrs. Thompson was much bigger than he had initially imagined. It wasn't just about corruption in the local church, but about a scheme that involved millions of dollars and powerful people. And somewhere in the middle of it all was Mrs. Thompson, alive. Jack was sure now, but in danger. He needed to find her before it was too late. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Buddy became alert, his ears perked up. Jack prepared himself, unsure if it was Lisa or if they had been discovered. A figure emerged from the shadows between the shelves. Jack let out a sigh of relief as he recognized Lisa, but her tense expression made him realize something was wrong. "We have a problem," she said without beating around the bush. "Father Michael is dead." The words fell like a bomb in the silence of the archive room. Jack felt the blood freeze in his veins. The situation had just become exponentially more complicated. "How?" was all he managed to ask. "They found him in the church this morning," Lisa explained, her voice trembling slightly. "They're calling it an accident, but we know it wasn't," Jack completed. The look they exchanged was loaded with mutual understanding. The game had changed. The stakes were higher than ever. And now it wasn't just Mrs. Thompson's life that was in danger, but theirs as well. "What do we do now?" Lisa asked. The determination in her voice mixed with a touch of fear. Jack looked at Buddy, who was staring at him with intelligent and expectant eyes. He knew they were about to dive even deeper into this mystery, possibly putting their own lives at risk. But he also knew they couldn't back down now. "Now," he said, his voice firm, "we find Mrs. Thompson, and we expose this whole plot no matter the cost." The sun was already high in the sky outside, but in the dark room of the library basement, Jack, Lisa, and Buddy were preparing to dive even deeper into the shadows that threatened to engulf their small town. The clock in the church tower struck noon when Jack and Lisa emerged from the library, Buddy following closely behind. The news of Father Michael's passing had already spread through the town like wildfire, leaving a trail of commotion and speculation. "We need to act fast," Lisa whispered, her eyes scanning the square for suspicious faces. "With the priest out of the picture, whoever is behind all this will want to tie up loose ends." Jack nodded, his mind working furiously. "You mentioned that Sister Sarah seemed nervous in the last few days. Do you think she might know something?" "It's worth a try," Lisa replied. She was always close to Father Michael, but she also had a special fondness for Mrs. Thompson. They decided to split up to avoid drawing attention. While Lisa would go to the church under the pretext of covering the news for the local newspaper, Jack and Buddy would take a more discreet path through the back. The church was surrounded by a small crowd when Lisa arrived, local TV cameras and curious onlookers crowding the entrance. She managed to get through, showing her journalist badge, and soon found herself in the cool, shadowy interior of the building. Sister Sarah was sitting on a bench in the first row, her face pale and marked by tears. When she saw Lisa approach, her eyes widened in recognition and fear. "Sister Sarah," Lisa began softly, sitting down beside her, "I'm sorry for your loss. I know you and Father Michael were close." The nun nodded silently, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. "Sister," Lisa continued, lowering her voice, "I know this may seem like an inappropriate moment, but I need to ask you some questions about Mrs. Thompson." At the sound of the name, Sarah visibly startled. What do you want to know about her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. At that moment, Jack entered silently through the back door, Buddy at his side. Sister Sarah saw them, and, to Lisa's surprise, a look of relief crossed her face. "Thank God you're here," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I can't bear to carry this secret any longer." In the minutes that followed, the story came out like a torrent. Sarah revealed that Mrs. Thompson had discovered not just the fund diversion scheme, but a much larger plot involving the real estate development and powerful figures in local politics. Father Michael was being blackmailed, Sarah explained, tears streaming down her face. They forced him to participate in the scheme, threatening to expose certain indiscretions from his past. "And Mrs. Thompson?" Jack gently pressed. "She's alive," the nun confirmed, to everyone's relief. When she confronted the priest with her discoveries, he panicked, but he couldn't couldn't harm her. So we devised a plan to fake her death and hide her until we could find a way out. Where is she now? Lisa asked urgently. Sarah hesitated, looking nervously around. In the abandoned convent in the hills. There's a secret passage that leads to a hidden room. She's there waiting for it to be safe to come out. Jack and Lisa exchanged looks. Finally, the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. And Father Michael? Jack asked softly. What really happened to him? Sarah's eyes filled with fresh tears. He decided he couldn't live with the guilt anymore. He left a detailed confession in his room, but someone got there before me this morning and took it. The sound of doors opening abruptly interrupted the conversation. Excited voices echoed through the church, and heavy footsteps were rapidly approaching. Quick, Sarah whispered, pulling them behind the altar. There's a secret passage here. Go to the convent and find Mrs. Thompson. I'll delay them. But what about you? Lisa asked, hesitant. I'll be fine, the nun assured with a sad smile. It's time for me to face the truth too. With heavy hearts, Jack and Lisa followed Buddy through the narrow passage that opened behind an altar panel. As the passage closed behind them, they could hear Sarah's firm voice confronting the newcomers. The tunnel was dark and damp, illuminated only by the weak light from Jack's cell phone. Buddy led the way, his nose guiding them through the underground labyrinth. Do you think Sister Sarah will be okay? Lisa whispered, her voice echoing slightly off the stone walls. I hope so, Jack replied. But now our priority is to find Mrs. Thompson and expose this whole plot. After what seemed like an eternity, the tunnel began to slope upward. Finally, they emerged in a small abandoned chapel, covered in ivy and dust. The convent, Lisa murmured, recognizing the place from stories her grandmother used to tell. Buddy barked softly, his tail wagging with enthusiasm. He clearly sensed the presence of his owner. Guided by the dog's instinct, they navigated the silent corridors of the convent, alert to any sound. Finally, they reached an apparently solid wall at the end of a corridor. Jack pressed several stones, remembering Sarah's instructions, until a soft click was heard. The wall slid to the side, revealing a small room illuminated by candles. And there, sitting in an old armchair with a book in her lap, was Mrs. Thompson. Her eyes widened at the sight of the visitors, a smile lighting up her wrinkled face when Buddy ran to her, barking joyfully. "Oh, my dears," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You finally found me." Jack and Lisa looked at each other, a mix of relief and determination on their faces. They had found Mrs. Thompson, but they knew the battle was far from over. Now, with the pieces of the puzzle finally together, it was time to confront those who threatened the heart of their small town. As Mrs. Thompson hugged Buddy, tears of joy in her eyes, Jack and Lisa silently vowed that they would do whatever it took to protect her and expose the truth. The journey had been long and dangerous, but the real challenge was yet to come. The sun was beginning to set when Jack, Lisa, Mrs. Thompson, and Buddy emerged from the abandoned convent. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, a beauty that contrasted drastically with the tension that hung over the group. "We can't just go back to town," Jack said, his eyes scanning the horizon for any suspicious movement. "They probably already know we've found her." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her face tired but determined. "You're right, my dears. It's time we face this head-on. I can't hide anymore while our town is corrupted by this unbridled greed." Lisa, who had been checking her cell phone, let out a surprised exclamation. "Guys, you won't believe this. Sister Sarah did a live broadcast on social media. She told everything." The others crowded around her, watching the video with a mixture of shock and admiration. The nun, with a trembling but firm voice, exposed the entire plot. The corruption scheme, the blackmail against Father Michael, Mrs. Thompson's fake disappearance. "This changes everything," Jack murmured. "Now they can't cover up the case anymore." "But it also means we're in even more danger," Mrs. Thompson warned. "Those involved will try to save themselves at any cost." As if to confirm her words, the distant sound of sirens began to echo through the valley. Vehicle lights could be seen climbing the winding road that led to the convent. "Quick," Lisa said, guiding them to a side path. "I know a shortcut that will take us directly to City Hall. If we're going to confront those responsible, that's where we need to be." The group moved quickly along the steep trail, with Buddy in front, as if understanding the urgency of the situation. The growing darkness helped them stay hidden, but also made the path more dangerous. As they descended, Mrs. Thompson shared more details about what she had discovered. The scheme was even more extensive than they had imagined, involving not only the diversion of church funds, but also bribes in public contracts and money laundering through the resort project. "The mayor is at the center of it all," she revealed, breathless from the walk. "He and a group of businessmen are behind the development. My property was the last obstacle for them." When they finally reached the town limits, they were greeted by a scene of chaos. Police cars and TV station vans crowded the streets. A crowd had gathered in front of City Hall, demanding explanations. "How are we going to get in there?" Jack asked, observing the reinforced security around the building. It was then that Buddy started barking, attracting the crowd's attention. In seconds, people recognized Mrs. Thompson, and a murmur of astonishment ran through the square. "It's her! Mrs. Thompson is alive!" Like a wave, the crowd parted, creating a path for the group. Cameras turned in their direction, flashes firing non-stop. Jack and Lisa protectively flanked Mrs. Thompson, while Buddy kept people at a safe distance. When they reached the doors of City Hall, they found them blocked by security guards, but the pressure from the crowd and the unexpected presence of Mrs. Thompson were too much to resist. The doors opened, and the group entered the main lobby. Inside, they found a scene of contained panic. Employees were running back and forth, shredders were working at full speed, and raised voices were coming from the upper floor. "The mayor's office," Lisa indicated, guiding them up the stairs. When they reached the anteroom, they were greeted by the mayor's secretary, her face pale with shock at seeing Mrs. Thompson. He's in an emergency meeting," she stammered. "Not anymore," Mrs. Thompson declared, her voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone. Without waiting for permission, she pushed open the office doors and entered, followed closely by the others. The mayor was standing behind his desk, surrounded by men in suits whom Jack recognized as some of the region's most influential businessmen. Everyone froze at the sight of the group entering. "Eleanor?" the mayor stammered, his face a mask of disbelief and fear. "But how?" "Surprised to see me, Robert," Mrs. Thompson replied, her voice cutting. "I imagine so, considering the efforts you made to silence me." Chaos ensued in the room. Accusations flew from all sides, threats were made, desperate denials were uttered. But above it all, Mrs. Thompson's calm and firm voice could be heard, detailing every aspect of the conspiracy she had uncovered. Jack and Lisa watched, marveled at the strength and courage of the lady who, just a few days ago, everyone believed to be dead. Buddy, sitting faithfully beside his owner, kept a watchful eye on everyone in the room. As the truth came to light, the sound of more approaching sirens could be heard. This time they were federal police vehicles called to investigate the accusations of large-scale corruption. The mayor, seeing his web of lies crumbling, made one last desperate attempt. "You have no proof of any of this." "It's the word of a senile old woman against—" His words were interrupted by Lisa, who calmly placed her cell phone on the desk. "Actually, we do. Live broadcast, Mr. Mayor. The whole town, the state, and probably the entire country just heard your confession." The silence that followed was deafening. The mayor collapsed into his chair, defeated, while the other men in the room frantically sought a way out. At that moment, federal agents burst into the office, led by a stern-faced detective. "All of you are detained for questioning," he announced. "We have a lot to talk about." As the suspects were escorted out, Jack, Lisa, and Mrs. Thompson looked at each other, a mixture of relief and disbelief on their faces. They had done it. The truth had finally come to light. Outside, the crowd was anxiously awaiting news. When Mrs. Thompson emerged from City Hall, she was greeted by a deafening ovation. Camera flashes illuminated the night, capturing the moment when truth triumphed over corruption. As Jack observed the scene, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Lisa, her eyes shining with tears of emotion. "We did it," she whispered. Jack nodded, a tired but satisfied smile on his face. "Yes, we did." The battle was won, but they knew the journey was far from over. There would be investigations, trials, and hopefully justice. But on that night, as the small town celebrated the victory of truth, Jack, Lisa, Mrs. Thompson, and the faithful Buddy allowed themselves a moment of pure joy. The darkness that threatened to engulf the town had been dissipated, at least for now. And although new challenges would certainly arise, they would face them together, strengthened by the friendship forged through this incredible journey. The first rays of the morning sun found Jack sitting on the porch of Mrs. Thompson's house, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. Buddy slept peacefully at his feet, occasionally stirring in his canine sleep. The garden, previously neglected during his owner's fake disappearance, now showed the first signs of renewal. The weeks following the dramatic revelation at City Hall had been a whirlwind of activities. Investigations were opened, testimonies were taken, and slowly, the full extent of the corruption that plagued the town came to light. Lisa arrived, bringing the day's newspaper with her. Its headline screamed, "Justice prevails, ex-mayor and businessman convicted." She sat down next to Jack, a tired but satisfied smile on her face. "Looks like it's finally over," she said, flipping through the pages of the newspaper. Jack nodded, his eyes scanning the town's horizon. "In a way, yes, but it's also just the beginning." Mrs. Thompson joined them on the porch, bringing a tray with freshly baked cookies. Despite the trials she had been through, there was a new light in her eyes, a renewed determination. "You two," she said, sitting down, "have no idea how much you mean to me and to this town. Without you, the truth would never have come to light." Jack and Lisa exchanged glances, a slight blush tinting their cheeks. Throughout their journey to unravel the mystery, a special bond had formed between them, something that went beyond mere friendship. "What happened to Sister Sarah?" Jack asked, changing the subject. "She decided to leave the convent," Mrs. Thompson replied. "She's working with a support group for victims of abuse and corruption. She's found a new vocation, helping others find their voice." Lisa smiled. "And the resort project?" "Cancelled, thank God," said Mrs. Thompson, "but we have better plans for those lands now." She explained that, with Jack and Lisa's help, she was working on a project to transform the area into a community park and cultural center, a place that would celebrate the town's history and provide a space for new stories to flourish. "Speaking of which," Mrs. Thompson continued, her eyes shining with a touch of mischief, "what do you two plan to do now? Jack, you came to our town as a stranger, but now you're practically a local hero." Jack laughed, a bit embarrassed. "I don't know if I'd go that far, but, well, I think I've found a place I can call home." His gaze met Lisa's, who smiled shyly. "And I," she said, "discovered that there's much more to my hometown than I ever imagined, stories waiting to be told." Buddy, as if sensing the change in the air, got up and stretched, looking expectantly at the three of them. Mrs. Thompson laughed. "I think someone's asking for a walk." They stood up, ready for a stroll through the town that now seemed to be reborn. The streets were busier than usual for a Sunday morning. People were greeting each other with genuine smiles. There was a palpable sense of community in the air. They passed by the church where a group of volunteers was working to restore the garden. The new priest, a young and enthusiastic man, waved at them. Trust in the institution was slowly being rebuilt, a process that would take time, but was already showing promising signs. In the central square, an outdoor exhibition showed photos and documents related to the case, part of an effort to ensure that the story wouldn't be forgotten or repeated. Children were running between the panels, unconsciously absorbing a lesson about the importance of truth and justice. They reached the old property that would have been the resort, now a construction site of a different kind. Volunteers were planting trees, building benches, and planning paths for the future park. "It's amazing how things can change in such a short time," Lisa observed, marveling at the transformation. Jack nodded. "It's the power of truth. Once it comes to light, it can change everything." Mrs. Thompson smiled, a glimmer of wisdom in her eyes. "And that's why we must always fight for it, no matter the cost." As they walked back, the sun now high in the sky, they reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The mystery that had begun with a bark at a fake funeral had unfolded into a plot that shook the foundations of the town. But from the ruins of corruption, something new and hopeful was emerging. Jack, who had arrived as a stranger, now felt deeply connected to this place and its people. Lisa had rediscovered her love for her hometown, now seeing it through new eyes, and Mrs. Thompson, whose supposed departure had been the catalyst for everything, was now more alive and active than ever. Back on the porch, they observed the town sprawling before them. The future, once uncertain and gloomy, now seemed bright and full of possibilities. "You know," Jack said, breaking the contemplative silence. "When I arrived here, I never imagined I'd get involved in something like this. But now, I can't imagine having done anything different." Lisa took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "Sometimes life takes us down unexpected paths. The important thing is to have the courage to keep moving forward." Mrs. Thompson watched the two with a fond smile. "And sometimes," she added, "those paths lead us exactly where we need to be." Buddy barked cheerfully, as if agreeing. The sound echoed through the town, no longer a cry of alarm but a celebration of a new beginning. As the day progressed, the three, now four counting Buddy, remained on the porch, sharing stories, laughing at recent memories, and making plans for the future. The journey that had begun with a mystery had transformed into something much greater, a story of friendship, courage, and the transformative power of truth. And so, in that small town that had almost succumbed to the darkness of corruption, a new chapter was beginning. A chapter of hope, renewal, and endless possibilities. Jack, Lisa, Mrs. Thompson, and the faithful Buddy were ready to write it together, one day at a time. Dear listeners, we hope that the journey of Jack, Lisa, and Mrs. Thompson has touched your hearts. To continue this exciting voyage, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories. Find it by clicking on the link to the left. If you enjoyed this narrative, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give the video a like. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life. Don't miss our upcoming content. We eagerly await your comments.